we are going to do as good a job as possible in trying to cover as much material about Samuel as possible. I think about my association and familiarity with someone like Samuel. As you contemplate lessons that you have heard over the years, I know that all of us have heard lessons on subjects like Noah, Abraham, Job, Joseph, Noah. I mean, you think about those lessons. I just wonder over a lifetime how many times I've heard lessons that related to the lives of those individuals. You know, not only do you have these people like Moses and Noah and Abraham, for which you've heard countless lessons, maybe dozens of them over your lifetime. There's even some odious characters in the Old Testament and New Testament that we've heard numerous lessons on, like Jeroboam, who gave us a guaranteed plan for apostasy in 1 Kings 12. And then Jezebel in 1 Kings. As evil as she was, yet I've heard lessons on Jezebel and several lessons on her over the time that I've been a Christian. And how many of us have not heard lessons on the devil? So you look at this, you think about all those lessons I've heard that involve characters. I've heard a lot of the same lessons over and over again, but can you remember the last time you heard a lesson on Samuel? I mean, it's not necessarily a real popular topic, and yet as I prepared the material for it, I thought to myself, why wouldn't it be? I mean, why haven't I preached on Samuel before now? Obviously, I prepared a lesson because of this Vacation Bible School, but then as I look at his character, there are so many great lessons to learn from Samuel. I mean, I think about a few things that maybe just kind of quickly identify him. He was obviously one of the first prophets that God ever called to be a prophet. Now you say, well, yeah, but wasn't Moses before him? He was. Deuteronomy 18 talked about Moses being a prophet, talking about the great prophet who Moses was a foreshadow of Jesus coming. But then after him, the Bible said in 1 Samuel 3 that from Dan to Beersheba, that Samuel was established to be a prophet. And we understand the greatness of what a prophet does, that a prophet does both foretelling of what is about to happen, but also forthtelling, that is, speaking on God's behalf. Amos said this, he said, surely God will do nothing that he doesn't reveal it unto us by his servants, the prophet. And Samuel certainly was a true prophet. And Amos was an individual who declared as well that, you know, when he was down in Judah, it wasn't his desire to go up into Israel and prophesy against them, but God had sent him to do that. And he said, now hear the word of the Lord. So the prophet had a valuable place to play back in that day, much like a preacher today who God is relying upon to stand forth and declare his will to men. And so Samuel was a person who's one of the early prophets. He's one of the last judges. In fact, the scriptures do say that he appointed his no good sons to be judges after him, but God never sanctioned it. God never really acknowledged them because of their desire for filthy lucre and taking bribes and doing things that were deceitful, where God never really ordained them to do such. And so God didn't acknowledge it. And so Samuel truly was one of the last judges. He was one of the ones who I would think of as a forerunner, because he was preparing the dynasty to be established with David that would go ahead and continue throughout the divided kingdom in Judah, as every king was descendant of David. And God even raised up someone to sit on the throne of David, talking about Jesus. But he was the one who was, to some degree, a forerunner, just like John the Baptizer, who was sent to prepare the way for Jesus. Samuel was the one who was preparing the way for the first king to rule, King Saul, and then later King David. He was the writer principally of the bulk of the material in 1 and 2 Samuel. We can't necessarily say he wrote every bit of it. We believe that 1 and 2 Samuel is part of God's inspired word, 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. But Samuel, for the most part, is credited with giving the information as provided for us in those books, and truly was one of the great leaders of Israel through the time that the people were united under one, of course, head, that is, during the reigns of King Saul, King David, and later King Solomon. I don't know if you even are aware of this statement. It's not even made in the book of 1 Samuel, but it talks about Samuel, and it kind of sets the tone for our study tonight, and it's found over in Jeremiah chapter number 15 and verse number 1. And I have enough material. I don't want to just run right through it to the point you don't get this. But there's so much to say about Samuel. I know I'm going to be pressed for time, so I'm going to go ahead and read, but I would like to invite you to go over in Jeremiah and look at the statement again. But the Bible said, "Then said the Lord unto me, though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my mind could not be toward this people. Cast them out of my sight and let them go forth." Now, any time that anybody is linked with Moses, and their name could be used in the same setting and in the same passage. Now, I've got to wake up and take a little bit of notice of that. God is here highlighting not only the life of Moses, but also of a man named Samuel. But he said this, that even though their desire was to do what God said, and their mind aligned with the mind of God, that wasn't going to be good enough to save the people. Remember when the people sinned by creating that golden calf, as Aaron and the people turned against God and violated those two commandments? "I'm the Lord your God, brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now the house of bondage, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make to thee any graven image." Before he even got down with those stones that God had written, with those laws containing it, they'd already violated the first two. And God was ready to destroy the people, and he was going to make a nation with Moses alone. And remember the plea that Moses made. Look, save them, and if not, just blot me out of your book. I'm not going to say that. Later he would say the soul that sins, basically what Ezekiel said in 18:20, it's the soul that sins that die. I'm not going to save them, being sinners, and not rescue you. And if that's necessary, I'll make my people of you and your descendants. But here's Moses being highlighted, and right along his name, beside his name, is Samuel. And the Bible says that their minds were aligned with God. I believe that what that means is just like Moses pled for the people and loved them so much that he was willing to lead them and to give himself for them. I think Samuel was the same kind of person. And so they are brought into clear and plain view in Jeremiah chapter 15 and 1 as two people who set themselves apart in their generation. I think there's plenty of things that we can gather tonight, and I'm going to go ahead. When I finally realized just how much time that I would have tonight, Brian said, "How are you going to ever squeeze this in?" And I told her, I'm going to kind of jump around. What I really think I've decided I will do tonight about Samuel. And I know you're not going to be able to follow along. I had a good PowerPoint presentation. I wish you could see it. But since you can't follow along with that tonight, what I'm going to do is give you 5 basic headings and descriptions that I believe about Samuel. And the way I want to approach this lesson is this way. If Samuel was such a good man, and Jeremiah 15:1 said he was, and if more is said about Samuel than you might even care to even know, and by the time the night is over, you're going to see just how much the Bible stated and declared about him and how good a person he was. Why then was Samuel considered to be a rejected hero? And that's the way I titled this lesson, A Rejected Hero. And already, without me going into too much detail, can't you see a parallel between a man who rose up among his people and was to some degree a deliverer for them, and yet the very people that he was working to deliver and help turned their back on him? Hey, you remember the story about Jesus in the New Testament? He came into his own, and his own received him not, but to them that received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. He came into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He came into the world to be a deliverer, and guess what? Jesus was the rejected hero. So I could have really formulated a lesson and made contrast tonight, and I'm certain of it, that I could have come up with 4 or 5 similarities between Samuel and Jesus Christ, both of them being rejected heroes of God. And obviously Jesus would have been the greatest, but still there would be so many parallels that we could draw to their life. I want to give you 5 points tonight about Samuel that really amazes me, that people would have rejected him as a great hero of God when you consider just how great a man Samuel was. The first thing is, consider the consecration of Samuel. I'd like to believe that I've got a son and daughter now who are pretty good people because of the impact and influence I had in their lives. Now, most people would say that my wife is to be given a lot more credit than I am with them, but I can say this. How many times have you seen real greatness in individuals if you don't sort of see a foundation laid for that by a family member or loved one who prepared the way for them? You can't really talk about Samuel if you don't go back and think about, well, what kind of family did he have? What kind of upbringing would have impacted a person to the extent that when he was such a little bitty boy, when he was just weaned, he was lent to the Lord and he served the Lord all the days of his life. I'll tell you what, you wouldn't have had that much greatness if you didn't have the kind of woman that was his mother, and her name was Hannah. So you can't really talk about Samuel and his greatness without talking about the consecration of him and how he was readied for the position that he worked in. And I think back to the days in 1 Samuel, chapter number 1, chapter number 2, when you first come into contact with Hannah, you're described about a man named Elkanah. He is of a priestly tribe. I mean, if you go back and look and follow it up, so he would have been very appropriately chosen to be a priest as he became a priest, since he was of a priestly tribe to start with. And so here was this man named Elkanah, and he had a wife named Hannah, but he also had a wife named Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah was not able to have children. So you see how frustrated she was with regard to the fact that she wanted to have children, was unable to do so. And our minds go back to that time when Eli was in the temple and she was praying and pouring out her heart to God, and she was talking to God in prayer. She was moving her lips, but nothing was coming out. Eli thought she was drinking. He thought she was a drunk woman. Said, look, you better quit that drinking. Don't come here to the temple if you're going to be drinking. And he tells her, look, or she tells him, I poured out my heart to God. She was speaking, but the words weren't coming out. And so as a result of that prayer and her earnestness, you see the firstborn, which was Samuel. And after that, you see the great favor that he had with God. It actually means that God has heard. Samuel's name did. So when she prayed, she said that if she would have a son, she would lend him to the Lord all the days of his life. There wouldn't be a razor that came upon his head, so he would have the Nazirite vow and he would keep it as far as the days of his life is concerned. And then you see Hannah's faithfulness. And I don't know that I ever remember this being told me, but you know, the Bible tells us that, yeah, she had a son finally named Samuel. And she was rejoicing as a result of that. She finally could have children, but that wasn't the end of it. Hannah was able to have 5 other children, 3 more sons and 2 more daughters as a result of her faithfulness and her earnest prayer unto God. And I think about that. You think about a great lesson that falls out of the early life of Samuel and Hannah. Right here it is. Here was Hannah praying for a son and saying, look, you give me a son, he'll serve you all the days of his life. He's going to live the life of a Nazirite. He'll keep himself special for you. And then keep in mind that God gave gave Samuel, but also 5 other children as well. I wish we were more aware and cognizant of the way God blesses us, just like he did Hannah. And how many times is it that when we finally ask for something and we receive it, that what we end up getting was a whole lot better than we ever expected? You ever notice that? I mean, I'll give you a great example in the Old Testament. Remember Samuel or Solomon when he got ready to rule over Israel? And when God gave him the choice to choose anything that he wanted, he asked for wisdom that he might rule this thy great people. You remember what God said? Okay, if you want wisdom, you got wisdom, but you don't get anything else. That's not what God did, was it? He said, not only am I going to give you wisdom, but because you didn't ask for it, I'm going to give you wealth that's immeasurable. And he said, I'll give you victory over your enemies. I'm going to establish you, and you're going to become great. Solomon asked for wisdom, but he got a whole lot more. In Acts chapter 3, again, we are just reminded of the fact that when we ask God blessings and he answers our prayers and he pours it out upon us, most of the time it's a whole lot better than we could ever imagine. Remember when Peter and John went to the temple there in Acts chapter 3? And there was that lame man. He had been lame almost 40 years. I think maybe it was 40 years of his life. All his life he had been sitting there begging for alms. And all he wanted that day is, do you have a little change? Do you have some money? How long would that have helped him? Maybe a few hours? Maybe a day or two? You remember what Peter said? Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I thee in the name of Jesus Christ. He said, rise up and walk. He asked for money, but he got something a whole lot more. Something a whole lot better. And so I'm reminded of this situation with Hannah and Samuel, and I understand how it applies to my own life. And the fact that in my relationship with God and in the prayers that I make and the requests that are made, when God answers my prayers, not only does he give me the things that I ask for, but normally what I receive from God is a whole lot better than I could have ever imagined. And we understand that even better as a result of Hannah and what she was able to receive as a result of a prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2. And then you see Samuel's great favor with God at that particular time. He ministered to the Lord. He ministered to Eli. And did you notice the Bible said that he matured just like Christ, almost identical. I mean, if you go back and look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26, and compare that with what the Bible said about Jesus, the Bible said about Samuel that Samuel grew in stature and in favor with God and man. In Luke chapter 2 and verse number 52, the Bible said that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man, just like Samuel did. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you can see a parallel between Jesus and Samuel as the rejected hero, but you can even see a little bit of similarity here in the way that Samuel grew. He grew exactly the way the Bible said that Jesus grew in Luke chapter 2 and verse number 52. Let's go to a second point now, and let's look at, for just a few minutes, the very next chapter. And I actually read and studied the opening 12 chapters of 1 Samuel to be able to prepare this lesson. But the next major point in Samuel's life, I think, comes out in chapter number 3, where you see the call of Samuel. And if you start reading in verse number 1 and start reading all the way through verse number 18, you know that Eli has delivered unto him this little boy named Samuel, and that Samuel continues to labor with him. And at that particular time, there's really no communication that's going on between God and man. Remember what I said a little bit earlier about Amos and the work of a prophet? It said, surely God will do nothing that he doesn't reveal it unto us by his servants, the prophets, in Amos chapter 3 and verse number 7. So finally, God found a servant that he would communicate with, that he would reveal his will to. And so Eli and Samuel are laying down. They're getting ready to go to sleep at night. And Samuel hears a voice. And he assumes that it's Eli calling him. And so he rises up and goes to Eli. And Eli said, I wasn't the one that called you. Go back to bed. So he calls him a second time. Same thing is true. It wasn't Eli calling, so he sends him back to bed. He even calls on him a third time. And he tells him, I'm not the one calling on you, but the next time that you're called upon, it's obviously the Lord calling you. He said, just say to the Lord, speak, for thy servant heareth thee. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter number 3, that statement is made, and we contribute that to Samuel because obviously Eli told him what to say, but also we recognize what kind of man he was. God was preparing to reveal a message to him about what was about to take place. And so he did exactly what Eli told him to do, but he also demonstrated an attitude that Samuel would have all the days of his service to God. Wouldn't it be wonderful tonight as you think about the kind of attitude that Samuel served with? The kind that says, "Speak, for thy servant heareth thee." I remember when I worked at one congregation, I was there for 10 years, and I remember one of the deacons at that particular time. I never remember going to him and asking him to do something that he didn't come to me and say, "What is it that you need me to do?" I'll tell you what, for those of you that have never served as an elder or a preacher or as someone who is in charge of the responsibility of helping organize the worship service or some work activity, I'll tell you what, we really are starving for people that have that kind of willingness to work in our day and time. It just seems like we've gotten so preoccupied in things of this world that we've got time for everything under the sun. We'll meet every scheduling responsibility except when it comes to doing the Lord's will. The Lord's church at some point in time is going to have to wake up. I don't know what's happening to us. We're going to sleep. We're allowing the world around us, which is what this main lesson is all about, to impact us to a great degree. We're becoming more and more like the world around us, and yet the Bible tells us that the real salvation is in maintaining a difference between what the world is and what we are. But part of it is the servant mentality. I think about some of those statements that are made in the Bible, like, "And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you having all sufficiency in all things may abound unto every good work." I think about what he said over in 2 Corinthians about, "Moreover, brethren, I do you to wit concerning the mercy bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia." He said, "And this they did not as we first hoped, but first gave themselves to the Lord and us to the will of God." I mean, you think about it tonight. It's not necessarily more service or more money that we really need. I'll tell you what we really need tonight. What we need is servants. You know, if we get the servant, we'll get the service. If we get the servant, we'll get the money. We'll get everything that we need. The Lord will make sure that his work is provided for if we get people that are willing. Why not have a mentality like Samuel? "Speak, for thy servant heareth thee." So God commissioned him. He commissioned him to be a preparer for the kingdom as there would be the rise of King Saul and King David. He was a priest. As I mentioned earlier, he was from a priestly family, from the family of Elkanah, and he was a great prophet. So he was called and he fulfilled those responsibilities. I'm not going to spend too much time on, have you ever studied about the circuit of Samuel? Samuel was an old circuit preacher. Now, I don't remember that I've ever been associated with the church. I grew up in denominational religion. I don't remember circuit preachers. And maybe there was a time even when we had brethren that went from place to place to place. But it's interesting reading. If you go and look at 1 Samuel chapter number 7, where Samuel is a circuit preacher and he goes to, over a year's time, to 4 different locations. He's from the city of Ramah, is where he's from. But the Bible tells us that he would make a circuit every year and that he would go to the various cities during the time that he made that circuit. And as he would go, he would make a challenge unto them, and he was pretty straightforward in his preaching. If you want to know what kind of preacher he was, 1 Samuel chapter 7 tells us, notice verse number 3 and 4, "And Samuel spake unto all the house of Israel, saying, If you do return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel did put away Balaam and Ashtaroth and served the Lord only." Not only was he an effective preacher, but the people gladly heard him. And he was able to rid the people at that particular time of much of their idolatry and immorality. So you see him as a circuit preacher. And then in this same chapter, what's really interesting as well is he calls all these people together at Mizpah. They have this celebration because all Israel is now prepared to follow him. He's a good preacher. They're listening to what he has to say. And then God shakes up the Philistines at this particular time. And guess what? He raises up a stone called the Ebenezer. And that in and of itself is a lesson, but that is recorded for us in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. And I wish I could say more about this, but it was interesting study. But if you look at verse 16 and 17, it tells us that he was the judge all the days of his life, and he went from year to year in circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah and judged Israel in all those places, and his return was to Ramah. For there was in his house, and there he judged Israel, and there he built an altar unto the Lord. Interesting stuff, but I just don't have time to say anything other than we appreciate what he did here in his preaching and teaching. You see his genuine candor as he taught. He didn't mince words. He spoke and said exactly what needed to be said. And these were not easy issues to deal with in his day and time. He was talking to people who had been idolaters, who's allowed a lot of the impact of the Philistines to play upon them, and yet he helped them put away their idolatry. And so he was genuine and told them the truth. You know, not only did he tell them the truth about the idolatry, but also he told, of course, Eli the truth, that Eli was going to be judged. And even though he was reluctant to tell Eli what was to take place, he told him matter-of-factly what was going to take place. Said, you know, your sons, they are sons of Belial. They know not the Lord. They made themselves vile. You restrained them not. And he said, God's going to do something in which when people hear it, it's going to make their ears tingle because of what he's about to do to this nation. And so, of course, we do know the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant. The death of Hophni and Phinehas took place. You had the death of a woman, the daughter-in-law of Eli, as of course she was given birth in the name of the son, Ichabod, that the glory of God had departed from Israel. But Samuel had told them the truth regarding that. And also you see his great courage later in 1 Samuel chapter 15 when he takes a sword to Agag and hews him into pieces and then declares unto the people at that particular time that to obey is better than hearken, and the sacrifice than the fat of rams. Look, God never did need us to build storehouses or distribution centers and lay up everything that we think we need, what God really wants us to do. You obey, and guess what? God takes care of the rest. That's why he says in the New Testament, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things shall be added to you. How much time we got? Is that the 5 minute yet? So I've got 2 minutes. Man, it's just amazing how much the time flies when you're having fun. And this is fun stuff here. Because the main reason I wanted to talk to you about a rejected hero is the fourth point, and that is the character of Samuel. You know, if I were going to pick out one subject, one line with regard to Samuel that separated him from most of the people in his day, it would have been this very thing. In a day and time where people profess to be a lot of things and put on facades and maybe pretend, Samuel was a person who had genuine character. One of the things that I'll challenge you to go back and look at in the life of Samuel is notice how many times the people get into crisis and the first thing Samuel does is get down on his knees and cry to God. We live in a country, we live in a time where most of us think the next president of the United States is going to be our deliverer. We think that we're going to elect somebody, he's going to straighten everything out. And we're not doing anything different than what Israel did in the past, where rather than going to God about everything that we face, they always ran down to Egypt to find the solution. God was the answer, and Samuel showed that as much as anybody. You know, with regard to character, I love to talk about character because I tell you what, just because a person professes something don't mean they're truly of good character. And the Bible tells us that it's more than just It's more than just saying we're something. It's actually being something. When I think about it, I think about, 2 or 3 things about character that we'd want to remember is that character is what I am willing to do when nobody else is looking. If you want to know what kind of character you have, then when nobody else is around, how do you behave then? Do you behave like you would on Sunday morning in a worship assembly? Would you behave like you would when your family members are around? But another thing about that is character is more than words. Somebody once said, you watch your thoughts because thoughts become words. You watch your words because your words, they can become deeds. You watch your deeds because they can become habits. And you watch your habits because that's what becomes your character. A reputation is what our brethren think of us and what people who know us think of us. Character is what God knows us to be. When Samuel pled with God to do something about the people because they were rejecting him and they wanted to be like the nations around them, God told Samuel, I don't want you to feel bad because it's not anything you've done. You see, they're not rejecting you, they are rejecting me. It wasn't because of the character of Samuel, because Samuel was truly of choice character. And God knew what Samuel was, and Samuel was, in God's eyes, just what you and I are typically when everybody looks on, but he had it because he was of good heart. So the one thing I would say in closing too, when I think about the character of him, and I'll say more about it probably in the invitation, but that is, when you think about what it is that God has called us to be, God didn't call us out of the world to be like the world. He called us out of the world to be different. Samuel was different. He had genuine character, and I'd like to challenge all of us to try to be a little bit more like him. The last point, if you wanted to know, was the commendation of Samuel. There are statements, 4 of them in the Bible, that hold up Samuel, and sometimes you find them in some of the most strange places, like over in Psalm 66, verse number 19. But anyway, the commendation of Samuel, that was my last point. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I appreciate being able to speak with you this evening about the rejected hero.